Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet, the final installment. With dizzying speed, he concocts the following alibi. A murderer confesses spontaneously and in an idiotic way, with impossible details, to a murder so that they think he's crazy and stop suspecting him. Wasted effort. They start torturing him again. There's no use screaming that he was only joking. The detectives want to know. Our Lady knows that they will know. And because he's young, he thrashes about. He is a drowning man who is struggling against his gestures and upon whom, nevertheless, peace, the peace of the drowned, slowly descends. The detectives are now mentioning the names of all men murdered during the last 5 or 10 years, whose murderers have not been caught. The list lengthens. Our Lady has the needless revelation of the extraordinary ignorance of the police. The violent deaths unroll before his eyes. The detectives mention names, more names, and whack 'em. Finally, they're on the verge of saying to Our Lady, "Maybe you don't know his name." Not yet. They mention names and stare at the child's red face. It's a game. The guessing game. Am I getting warm? Rug on. His face is too upset to be able to express anything comprehensible. It's all in disorder. Our Lady screams, "Yes, it's him. Leave me alone." His hair is in his eyes. He tosses it back with a jerk of his head, and this simple gesture, which was his rarest precocity, signifies to him the vanity of the world. He wipes away some of the drool that is flowing from his mouth. Everything grows so calm that no one knows what to do. Overnight, the name of Our Lady of the Flowers was known throughout France, and France is used to confusion. Those who merely skimmed the newspapers did not linger over Our Lady of the Flowers. Those who go all the way to the end of the articles, scenting the unusual and tracking it down there every time, brought to light a miraculous haul. These readers were schoolchildren and the little old women who, out in the provinces, have remained like Ernestine, who was born old, like Jewish children who, at the age of 4, have the faces and gestures they will have at 50. It was indeed for her to enchant her twilight that Our Lady had killed an old man. Ever since she had started making up fatal tales, or stories that seemed flat and trivial, but in which certain explosive words ripped the canvas, showing through these gashes a bit of what went on, as it were, behind the scenes. People were staggered when they realized why she had talked that way. Her mouth was full of stories, and people wondered how they could be born of her, who every evening read only a dull newspaper. The stories were born of the newspaper, as mine are born of cheap novels. She used to stand behind the window, waiting for the postman. As the time for the mail approached, her anguish would heighten, and when she finally touched the gray, porous pages that oozed with the blood of tragedies, the blood whose smell she confused with the smell of the ink and paper, when she unfolded them on her knees like a napkin, she would sink back exhausted, utterly exhausted, in an old red armchair. A village priest, hearing the name of Our Lady of the Flowers float about him, without having received a pastoral letter concerning the matter one Sunday from the pulpit, ordered prayers and recommended this new cult to the particular devotion of the faithful. The faithful, sitting in their pews, quite startled, said not a word, thought not a thought. In a hamlet, the name of the flower known as the Queen of the Fields made a little girl who was thinking of Our Lady of the Flowers ask, "Mommy, is she someone who had a miracle?" There were other miracles that I haven't time to report. The taciturn and feverish traveler who arrives in a city does not fail to go straight to the dives, the red light districts, the brothels. He is guided by a mysterious sense that alerts him to the call of hidden love, or perhaps by the bearing of, the direction taken by, certain habitués whom he recognizes by sympathetic signs, by passwords exchanged between their subconscious minds, and whom he follows on trust. In like manner, Ernestine went straight to the tiny lines of the short crime items, which are the murders, robberies, rapes, armed assaults, the barrios chinos of the newspapers. She dreamed about them. Their concise violence, their precision left the dream neither time nor space to filter in. They floored her. They broke upon her brutally, in vivid, resounding colors. Red hands placed on a dancer's face, green faces, blue eyelids. When this tidal wave subsided, she would read all the titles of the musical selections listed in the radio column, but she would never have allowed a musical air to enter her room, for the slightest melody corrodes poetry. Thus, the newspapers were disturbing, as if they had been filled only with columns of crime news, columns as bloody and mutilated as torture stakes. And though the press had very parsimoniously given to the trial, which we shall read about tomorrow, only 10 lines, widely enough space to let the air circulate between the over-violent words, these 10 lines, more hypnotic than the fly of a hanged man, than the words hempen collar, than the word zouave, these 10 lines quickened the hearts of the old women and jealous children. Paris did not sleep. She hoped that the following day Our Lady would be sentenced to death. She desired it. In the morning, the sweepers, impervious to the sweet, sad absences of those sentenced to death, whether dead or not, to whom the criminal courts gives asylum, stirred up acrid dust, ordered the floor, spat, blasphemed, and joked with the court clerks, who were setting out the files. The hearing was to begin at exactly 12:45, and at noon the porter opened the doors wide. The courtroom is not majestic, but it is very high, so that it gives a general impression of vertical lines, like lines of quiet rain. Upon entering, one sees on the wall a big painting with a figure of Justice, who is a woman, wearing big red drapings. She is leaning with all her weight upon a saber, here called a gliave, which does not bend. Below are the platform and table where the jurors and the presiding judge in ermine and red robe will come to sit in judgment on the child. The name of the presiding judge is Mr. Presiding Judge Vaz de Sainte-Marie. Once again, to attain its ends, destiny resorts to a low method. The 12 jurors are 12 decent men suddenly become sovereign judges. So, the courtroom had been filling up since noon. A banquet hall. The table was set. I should like to speak sympathetically about the courtroom crowd. Not because it was not hostile to Our Lady of the Flowers. I don't mind that. But because it is sparkling with 1,000 poetic gestures. It is as shuddering as taffeta. At the edge of a gulf, bristling with bayonets, Our Lady is dancing a perilous dance. The crowd is not gay. Its soul is sad unto death. It huddled together on the benches, drew its knees and buttocks together, wiped its collective nose, and attended to the 100 needs of a courtroom crowd that is going to be weighed down by so much majesty. The public comes here only insofar as a word may result in a beheading, and as it may return, like Saint Denis, carrying its severed head in its hands. It is sometimes said that death hovers over a people. Do you remember the skinny, consumptive Italian woman, that it was for la foi, and what it will later be for divine? Here, death is only a black wing without a body, a wing made with some remnants of black bunting and supported by a thin framework of umbrella ribs, a pirate banner without a staff. This wing of bunting floated over the court, which you are not to confuse with any other, for it is the court of law. The wing enveloped it in its folds and had detailed a green crepe de chine tie to represent it in the courtroom. The tie, which lay on the judge's table, was the only piece of evidence. Death, visible here, was a tie, and this fact pleases me. It was a light death. The crowd was ashamed of not being the murderer. The robed lawyers were carrying briefs under their arms and smiled as they greeted each other. They occasionally approached the little death quite closely and most pluckily. The newspaper men were with the lawyers. The delegates of the church youth centers were speaking in whispers among themselves. They were disputing a soul. Was it necessary to throw dice for it in order to send it to the Vosges? The lawyers, who despite their long silken robes do not have the gentle and death-driven bearing of ecclesiastics, kept coming together in little groups and then breaking up. They were very near the platform, and the crowd could hear them tuning up their instruments for the funeral march. The crowd was ashamed of not dying. The religion of the hour was to await and envy a young murderer. The murderer entered. All one could see was strapping Republican guards. The child emerged from the flanks of one of them, and the other unchained his wrists. Reporters have described the movements of the crowd when a famous criminal enters. I, therefore, refer the reader, if I may, to their articles, as my role in my art do not lie in describing mob behavior. Nevertheless, I shall make so bold as to say that all eyes could read, graven in the aura of Our Lady of the Flowers, the following words: I am the Immaculate Conception. The lack of light and air in his cell had made him neither too pale nor too puffy. The lines of his closed lips were the lines of a sober smile. His clear eyes knew nothing of hell. His entire face, but perhaps he stood before you like the prison which, as that woman walked by singing in the darkness, remained for her an evil wall, whereas all the cells were secretly taking flight, flown by the hands which were beating like wings of the convicts who were electrified by the singing. His image and his gestures released captive demons, or, with several turns of a key, locked in angels of light. He was wearing a very youthful gray flannel suit, and the collar of his blue shirt was open. His blonde hair kept falling over his eyes. You recall the toss of the head with which he drove it back. Thus, when he had everyone in front of him, Our Lady, the murderer, who in a little while would be dead, murdered in turn, tossed his head slightly, or blinking his eyes, which made his curly lock that fell close to his nose bound back to his head. This simple scene transports us, that is, it lifts up the moment, as the faker's oblivion to the world lifts him up and holds him suspended. The moment was no longer of the earth, but of the sky. Everything gave grounds for fear that the hearing might be chopped up into those cruel moments that would pull away trapdoors from under the feet of the judges, lawyers, Our Lady, and the guards, and, for an eternity, would leave them lifted up as fakirs. until the moment when slightly too deep a breath would restore the suspended life. The guard of honor, members of the colonial troops, entered noisily with their hobnailed boots and rattling bayonets. Our Lady thought it was the firing squad. Have I mentioned the fact that the audience was made up mostly of men, but all of them darkly dressed, with umbrellas on their arms and newspapers in their pockets, were shakier than a bower of wisteria, than the lace curtain of a crib. Our Lady of the Flowers was the reason why the courtroom, all invaded by a grotesque, dressed-up crowd, was a May hedgerow. The murderer was sitting on the criminal's bench. The removal of the chains enabled him to put his hands deep into his pockets. Thus, he seemed to be anywhere, that is, rather in the waiting room of an employment bureau or on a park bench, watching from afar a Punch and Judy show in a kiosk, or perhaps even in church, at Thursday catechism. I swear, he was waiting for anything. At a certain moment he took one hand out of his pocket and, as a while before, flicked back, with, at the same time, a toss of his pretty little head, the blonde curly lock. The crowd stopped breathing. He completed his gesture by smoothing back his hair down to the nape of the neck. And I am thereby reminded of a strange impression when, in a person who has been dehumanized by glory, we discern a familiar gesture, a vulgar gesture. There you have it, tossing back a lock of hair with a jerk of the head, that breaks the hardened crust, and through the crevice, which is as lovely as a smile or an error, we glimpse a patch of sky. I had once noted this in the case of one of Our Lady's 1,000 forerunners, an annunciatory angel of this virgin, a blonde young boy. Girls blonde as boys, I shall indeed never weary of this phrase, which has the charm of the expression, a French guard's woman, whom I used to watch in gymnasium groups. He depended upon the figures that helped him to form, and thus was only a sign. But whenever he had to place one knee on the floor, and, like a knight at a coronation, extend his arms at the word of command, his hair would fall over his eyes, and he would break the harmony of the gymnastic figure by pushing it back against his temples, and then behind his ears, which were small, with a gesture that described a curve with both his hands, which, for an instant, enclosed and pressed like a diadem his oblong skull. It would have been the gesture of a nun pushing against her veil if at the same time he had not shaken his head like a bird preening itself after drinking. It was also this discovery of the man in the god that once made Coulafoi love Alberto for his cowardice. Alberto's left eye had been gouged out. In a village, an event of this kind is no small matter. After the poem or fable that was born of it, recurring miracle of Anne Boleyn, from the streaming blood sprang a bush of roses that might have been white but were certainly fragrant. The necessary sifting was done in order to disengage the truth scattered beneath the marble. It then became apparent that Alberto had been unable to avoid a quarrel with his rival over his girlfriend. He had been cowardly as always, as the whole village knew him to be, and this had given victorious promptness to his opponent. With a stab of his knife, he had put out Alberto's eye. Oh, Coulafoi's love swelled up, as it were, when he learned of the accident. It swelled with grief, with heroism, and with maternal tenderness. He loved Alberto for his cowardice. Compared to this monstrous vice, the others were pale and inoffensive and could be counterbalanced by any other virtue, particularly the most beautiful. I use the popular word in the popular sense, which is so becoming to it, and which implies the fullest, recognition of the bodily powers, guts. For we may say of a man who is full of vices, all is not so lost, as he doesn't have that one. But Alberto did have that one, so it made no difference whether he had all the others. The infamy would have been none the greater. All is not lost so long as valor remains, and it was valor that Alberto had just lacked. As for suppressing this vice, for example, by pure and simple negation, that was out of the question. But it was easy to destroy its belittling effect by loving Alberto for his cowardice. Though his downfall, which was certain, did not embellish him, it poetized him. Perhaps Goulafoi drew closer to him because of it. Alberto's courage would not have surprised him, nor left him indifferent, but now, instead, he was discovering another Alberto, one who was more man than God. He was discovering the flesh. The statue was crying. Here, the word cowardice cannot have the moral or immoral sense usually ascribed to it. And Goulafoi's taste for a handsome, strong, and cowardly young man is not a fault or aberration. Goulafoi now saw Alberto prostrate, with a dagger stuck into his eye. Would he die of the wound? The idea made him think of the decorative roll of widows who wear long crepe trains and dab their eyes with little white handkerchiefs rolled up as tight as snowballs. He no longer thought of anything but observing the external signs of his grief. But, as he could not make it visible to people's eyes, he had to transport it into himself, as Saint Catherine of Siena transported herself. The country folk were confronted with the spectacle of a child who trailed behind him a display of ceremonial mourning weeds. They did not recognize it. They did not understand the meaning of the slowness of his walk, the bowing of his forehead, and the emptiness of his gaze. To them, it was all simply a matter of poses, dictated by the pride of being the child of the slate house. Alberto was taken to the hospital, where he died. The village was exorcised. Our Lady of the Flowers, his mouth was slightly open. Occasionally, he would shift his eyes to his feet, which the crowd hoped were wearing selvaged slippers. At the drop of a hat, they expected him to make a dance movement. The court clerks were still fussing with the records. On the table, the lithe little death lay inert and looked quite dead. The bayonets and the heels were sparkling. "The court!" The court entered by a door that was cut out of the wallpaper behind the juror's table. Our Lady, however, having heard in prison of the ceremoniousness of the court, imagined that today, by a kind of grandiose error, it would enter by the great public door, which opened in the middle, just as on Palm Sunday the clergy, who usually leave the sacristy by a side door near the choir, surprise the faithful by appearing from behind them. The court entered, with the familiar majesty of princes, by a service door. Our Lady had a foreboding that the whole session would be faked, and that at the end of the performance, his head would be cut off by means of a mirror trick. One of the guards shook his arm and said, "Stand up." He had wanted to say, "Please stand up," but he didn't dare. The audience was standing in silence. It sat down again, noisily. M. Vaz de Sainte-Marie was wearing a monocle. He looked shiftily at the tie, and with both hands fumbled about in the file. The file was as crammed with details as the chamber of the examining magistrate was crammed with files. Facing Our Lady, the prosecuting attorney did not let out a peep. He felt that a word from him, a too commonplace gesture, would transform him into the devil's advocate and would justify canonization of the murderer. It was a difficult moment to endure. He was risking his reputation. Our Lady was seated. A slight movement of M. Vaz de Sainte-Marie's fine hand brought him to his feet. The questioning began.
Your name is Adrien Bayon?
Yes, sir.
You were born on December 19th, 1920?
Yes, sir.
In
Paris.
Very well. Which district?
The 18th, sir.
Very well. Your acquaintances gave you a nickname.
He hesitated then.
Would you mind telling it to the court?
The murderer made no answer, but the name, without being uttered, emerged through the forehead, all winged from the brain of the crowd. It floated over the courtroom, invisible, fragrant, secret, mysterious. The judge replied aloud,
Yes, that's right. And you are the son of
Lucie Bayon.
And an unknown father, yes? The accusation.
Here the jurors, there were 12 of them, took a comfortable position which, though suiting each of them individually because it favored a certain propensity, was consistent with each one's dignity. Our Lady was still standing, with his arms dangling at his sides, like those of that bored and delighted little king, who from the stairway of the royal palace witnesses a military parade. The judge continued.
On the night of July 7th to 8th, 1937, entered, and no trace has been found of forced entry, into the apartment situated on the 5th floor of the building located at number 12, Rue de Vaugirard, and occupied by Monsieur Paul Ragon, 67 years of age.
He raised his head and looked at Our Lady.
Do you acknowledge the facts?
Yes, sir.
The investigation specifies that it was Monsieur Aragon himself who opened the door for you. At least, that is what you have stated, without being able to prove it. Do you still maintain it?
Yes, sir.
Then it happens that Monsieur Aragon, who knew you, seemed delighted with your visit and offered you liquor. Then, without his expecting it, with the help...
He hesitated.
Of this tie, you strangled him.
The judge took the tie.
Do you recognize this tie as belonging to you and as being the instrument of the crime?
Yes, sir. The judge had the soft tie in his fingers, a tie like a piece of ectoplasm, a tie that had to be looked at while there was still time, for it might disappear at any moment or stiffen in the dry hand of the judge, who felt that if it did actually become erect or disappear, he would be covered with ridicule. He therefore hastened to pass the instrument of the crime to the first juror, who passed it to his neighbor, and so on, without anyone's daring to linger over recognizing it, for each of them seemed to be running the risk of being metamorphosed before his own eyes into a Spanish dancer. But the precautions of these gentlemen were futile, and though they were not aware of it, they were thoroughly changed. The guilty gestures of the jurors, seemingly in connivance with the destiny that governed the murder of the old man and the murderer, who was as motionless as a mediumistic subject who is being questioned and who, by virtue of such immobility, is absent. In the place of this absence, all these darkened the courtroom, where the crowd wanted to see clearly. The judge droned on and on. He had reached the following point.
And who gave you the idea of this method of committing murder?
Him. The entire world understood that him was the dead man, who was now replaying a role, he who had been buried and devoured by worms and larvae.
The victim?
The judge started shouting frightfully.
It was the victim himself who showed you how you were to go about getting rid of him? Come now. Now, explain what you mean.
Our Lady seemed embarrassed. A gentle modesty prevented him from speaking. Shyness, too. Yes, you see, Monsieur Rangon was wearing a tie that was too tight. He was all red, so he took it off. And the murderer, very gently, as if he were consenting to an infamous deal or a charitable action, admitted, "So I thought that if I tightened it, it'd be worse." And a little lower still, barely loud enough for the guards and the judge, but it was lost on the crowd, "'cause I got good arms." The judge, overwhelmed, lowered his head. "You wretch!" he cried. "Why?" "I was fabulously broke." Since the word fabulous is used to qualify a fortune, it did not seem impossible to apply it to destitution. And this fabulous impecuniousness made for Our Lady a pedestal of cloud. He was prodigiously glorious as the body of Christ rising aloft, to dwell there alone and fixed in the sunny noonday sky. The judge was twisting his beautiful hands. The crowd was twisting its faces. The clerks were crumpling sheets of carbon paper. The eyes of the lawyers suddenly looked like those of extra-lucid chickens. The guards were officiating. Poetry was kneading its matter. Alone. Our Lady was alone and kept his dignity. That is, he still belonged to a primitive mythology and was unaware of his divinity and his divinization. The rest of the world knew not what to think and made superhuman efforts not to be carried off from the shore. Their hands, the nails of which had been ripped away, clung to any safety plank, crossing and uncrossing their legs, staring at stains on their jackets, thinking of the family of the strangled man, picking their teeth.
Now, explain to the court how you proceeded.
It was awful. Our Lady had to explain. The police had demanded details, so had the examining magistrate. And now it was the court's turn. Our Lady was ashamed, not of his deed, that was impossible, but of continually repeating the same old story. He was so tired of ending his account with the words, "until he was done for," that he boldly thought of giving a new version. He decided to relate something else. Yet, at the same time, he related exactly the story he had told in the very same words to the detectives, the judge, the lawyer, and the psychiatrists. For to Our Lady, a gesture is a poem, and can be expressed only with the help of a symbol, which is always, always the same. And all that remained with him of his 2-year-old act was the bare expression. He was rereading his crime as a chronicle is reread, but it was no longer really about the crime that he was talking. Meanwhile, the clock on the wall opposite him was behaving in orderly fashion, but time was out of order, and the result that every second the clock ticked off long periods and short ones. Of the 12 good old men, and true of the jury, 4 were wearing spectacles. These 4 were cut off from communion with the courtroom. Glass being a bad conductor, it insulates, and they followed elsewhere other adventures. In fact, none of them seemed interested in this murder case. One of the old men kept sleeking his beard. He was the only one who appeared to be attentive. But looking at him more closely, we see that his eyes are hollow, like those of statues. Another was made of cloth. Another was drawing circles and stars on the green table cover. In daily life, he was a painter, and his sense of humor led him at times to color pert little sparrows perched on a garden scarecrow. Another was spitting all his teeth into his pale blue, France blue, handkerchief. They stood up and followed the judge through the small hidden door. The deliberations are as secret as the election of a chief of masked bandits, as the execution of a traitor within a confraternity. The crowd relieved itself by yawning, stretching, and belching. Our Lady's lawyer left his bench and walked over to his client. "Keep your chin up, my boy," he said, squeezing Our Lady's hands. "You answered very well. You were frank. I think the jury is with us." As he spoke, he squeezed Our Lady's hands, supported him, or clung to him. Our Lady smiled. It was a smile that was enough to damn his judges, a smile so azure that the guards themselves had an intuition of the existence of God and of the great principles of geometry. Think of the moonlight tinkling of the toad. At night, it is so pure that the vagabond on the highway stops and does not go on until he has heard it again. "They putting up a fight?" he asked, winking. Yes, it's all right," said the lawyer. The guard of honor presented arms, and the unhooded court emerged from the wall. M. Vaz de Sainte-Marie sat down in silence. Then everyone sat down very noisily. The judge placed his head between his beautiful white hands and said, "We shall now hear the witnesses. Oh, first, let's look at the police report. Are the inspectors here?" It is extraordinary that a presiding judge should be so absent-minded as to forget so serious a thing. Our Lady was shocked by his mistake, just as he would have been shocked by a spelling mistake, had he known how to spell, in the prison regulations. A clerk ushered in the two detectives who had arrested Our Lady. The one who had formerly carried on the now 2-year-old investigation was dead. They therefore gave a succinct report of the facts, an astounding story in which a fake murder led to the discovery of a real one. This discovery is impossible. I'm dreaming. All because of a trifle. But after all, I admit this amusing discovery which leads to death. A little more readily ever since the guard took away the manuscript I had in my pocket during recreation. I have a feeling of catastrophe. Then I dare not believe that a catastrophe of this kind can be the logical outcome of such slight carelessness. Then I think of the fact that criminals lose their heads because of such slight carelessness, so slight that one should have the right to repair it by backing up, that it's so trifling that if one asked the judge, he would consent, and that one cannot. Despite their training, which they say is Cartesian, the members of the jury will be unable when, in a few hours, they condemn Our Lady to death, to figure out whether they did so because he strangled a doll or because he cut up a little old man into pieces. The detectives, instigators of anarchism, withdrew with a pretty kowtow to the judge. Outside, snow was falling. This could be guessed from the movement of the hands in the courtroom, which were turning up coat collars. The weather was overcast. Death was advancing stealthily over the snow. A clerk called the witnesses. They were waiting in a little side room, the door of which opened opposite the prisoner's box. The door opened. Each time, just enough to let them edge through sideways, and one by one, drop by drop, they were infused into the trial. They went straight to the bar, where each raised his right hand and replied, "I so swear," to a question no one was asked. Our Lady saw Mimosa too enter. The clerk, however, had called out René Hirsch. When he heard Antoine Berthollet, First Communion appeared. At Eugene Marceau, Lady Apple appeared. Thus, in the eyes of our bewildered lady, the little faggots from Pigalle to Place Blanche lost their loveliest adornment. Their names lost their corolla. like the paper flower that the dancer holds at his fingertips, and which, when the ballet is over, is a mere wire stem. Would it not have been better to have danced the entire dance with a simple wire? The question is worth examining. The faggots showed the framework that Darling discerned behind the silk and velvet of every armchair. They were reduced to nothing. And that's the best thing that's been done so far. They entered aggressively or shyly, perfumed, made up, expressed themselves with studied care. They were no longer the grove of crinkly paper that flowered on the terraces of cafes. They were misery in motley. Where do faggots get their nom de guerre? But first, it should be noted that none of them were chosen by those who bore them. This, however, does not hold for me. I can hardly give the exact reasons why I chose such and such a name. Divine, First Communion, Mimosa, Our Lady of the Flowers, and Milord the Prince did not occur to me by chance. There is a kinship among them, an odor of incense and melting taper. And I sometimes feel as if I had gathered them among the artificial or natural flowers in the chapel of the Virgin Mary in the month of May, under and about the greedy plaster statue that Alberto was in love with, and behind which, as a child, I used to hide the file containing my spunk. Some of them uttered a few words that were terrifyingly precise, such as, "He lived at 8 Rue Bert," or "I met him for the first time on October 17th. It was at Graf's Café." A raised pinky, lifted as if the thumb and forefinger were holding a teacup, disturbed the gravity of the session, and by means of this stray straw could be seen the tragic nature of its mass. The clerk called out, "Monsieur Louis Coulafoy," supported by Ernestine, who was wearing black and stood bolt upright, the only real woman to be seen at the trial. Divine entered. What remained of her beauty fled in confusion. The lines and shadows deserted their posts. It was a debacle. Her lovely face was utterly heart-rending. Appeals, howls as tragic as the cries of a dying woman. Divine was wearing a brown, silky camel hair coat. She, too, said, "I so swear."
"What do you know about the accused?"
asked the judge. "I've known him for a long time, Your Honor, but nevertheless I can say that I think he's very naive, very childlike. I've always regarded him as being very sweet. He could be my son." She went on to tell with a great deal of tact how they had lived together for a long time. There was no mention of Darling. Divine was at last the grown-up she had not been allowed to be anywhere else. By God! Here he is again, the witness who has finally emerged from the child Coulafoy, whom he had never ceased to be. If he never performs any simple act, it is because only a few old men can be simple, that is, pure, purged, simplified as a diagram, which is perhaps the state of being of which Jesus said, like unto little children,
though no child is ever like that,
which a lifelong withering labor does not always achieve. Nothing about him was simple, not even his smile, which he liked to draw out with the right corner of his mouth, or spread across his face with his teeth clenched. The greatness of a man is not only a function of his faculties, of his intelligence, of whatever gifts he may have. It is also made up of the circumstances that have elected him to serve them as support. A man is great if he has a great destiny, but his greatness is of the order of visible, measurable greatness. It is magnificence seen from without. Though it may be wretched when seen from within, it is then poetic, if you are willing to agree that poetry is the break, or rather, the meeting at the breaking point between the visible and the invisible. Coulafoy had a wretched destiny, and it is because of this that his life was composed of those secret acts, each of which is in essence a poem, as the infinitesimal movement of the finger of a Balinese dancer is a sign that can set a world in motion, because it issues from a world whose multifarious meaning is unavowable. Coup la foi became divine. He was thus a poem, written only for himself, hermetic to whoever did not have the key to it. In short, this is his secret glory, like the one I have decreed upon myself so as to obtain peace at last. And I have it, for a fortune-teller in a fair booth assured me that some day I would be famous.
With what sort of fame? I tremble at the thought.
But this prophecy is enough to calm my old need for thinking I have genius. I carry within me, preciously, the words of the augury. Some day you will be famous. I live with it in secret, like families in the evening by the lamp, and always, if they have one, with the shining memory of their kinsman who is sentenced to death. It illuminates and horrifies me. This quite virtual fame ennobles me, like a parchment that no one can decipher, an illustrious birth kept secret, a royal bar sinister, a mask, or perhaps a divine filiation, the kind of thing Josephine must have felt, she who never forgot that she had given birth to the child who was to become the prettiest woman in the village, Marie, the mother of Solange, the goddess, born in a hovel, who had more blazons on her body than Mimosa had on her buttocks and in her gestures, and more nobility than a Chambord. This kind of consecration had kept the other women of her age, the others, mothers of men, away from Josephine. In the village, her situation was akin to that of the mother of Jesus among the women of the Galilean village. Marie's beauty made the town illustrious. To be the human mother of a divinity is a more disturbing state than that of the divinity. The mother of Jesus must have had incomparable emotions while carrying her son, and later, while living and sleeping side by side with a son who was God, that is, everything, and herself as well, who could make the world not be his mother, himself not be, a God for whom she had to prepare, as Josephine did for Marie, the yellow corn mush. Moreover, it was not that Coulafroy, as child and divine, was of exceptional finesse, but exceptionally strange circumstances had chosen him as their place of election without informing him, had adorned him with a mysterious text. He served a poem in accordance with the whims of a rhyme, without rhyme or reason. It was later, at the hour of his death, that in a single wonder-struck glance he was able to reread, with his eyes closed, the life he had written upon his flesh. And now divine emerges from her inner drama, from that core of the tragic which she bears within her, and for the first time in her life is taken seriously in the parade of humans. The prosecuting attorney stopped the parade. The witnesses had left by the open door. Each having appeared for but a second, they burned up as they passed. The unknown whisked them away. The true centers of life were the witness room, a court of miracles, and the chamber of the jury. It was there that the room of the foul crime with all its accessories was reconstructed. The amazing thing was that the necktie was still there, crouching on the green table, paler than usual, soft but ready to dart forth as a slouching hoodlum on the bench in a police station might dart forth. The crowd was as restless as a dog. Someone announced that death had been delayed by a derailment. It grew dark all at once. Finally, the judge called upon the expert alienist. It was he who, really and truly, sprang up through an invisible trap door of an invisible box. He had been sitting among the audience, which had not suspected him. He stood up and walked to the bar. He read his report to the members of the jury. From the winged report dropped such words as the following: unbalanced, psychopathy, interrelation, splanchnic system, schizophrenia, unbalanced, equilibrist, and all at once, poignant, bleeding, the sympathetic nerve. He did not pause. Unbalanced, semi-responsibility, secretion, Freud, Jung, Adler, secretion. But the perfidious voice was caressing certain syllables, and the man's gestures were struggling against enemies. Father, watch out on the left, on the right. Certain words finally ricocheted on the perfidious voice, as in pig Latin, words where you have to unscramble other words that may be naive or nasty. Ebbe, urde. One understood the following: what is a malefactor? A tie dancing in the moonlight, an epileptic rug, a stairway going up flat on its belly, a dagger on the march since the beginning of the world, a panicky phial of poison, gloved hands in the darkness, a sailor's blue collar, an open succession, a series of benign and simple gestures, a silent hasp. The great psychiatrist finally read his conclusions: that he, Our Lady of the Flowers, is psychically unbalanced, non-effective, amoral, yet that in any criminal act, as in any act, there is an element of volition which is not due to the irritating complicity of things. In short, Ballion is partly responsible for the murder. Snow was falling. About the courtroom, all was silence. The criminal court was abandoned in infinite space, all alone. It had already ceased to obey the laws of the earth. Swiftly it flew across stars and planets. It was in the air, the stone house of the Holy Virgin. The passengers no longer expected help from the outside world. The moorings had been cut. It was at that moment that the frightened part of the courtroom, the crowd, the jurymen, the lawyers, the guards, should have dropped to their knees and broken out into hymns of praise, when the other part, Our Lady, freed from the weight of carnal labors — to put someone to death is a carnal labor — had organized itself as a couple and sung, "Life is a dream, a charming dream." But the crowd does not have the sense of grandeur. It does not obey this dramatic injunction, and nothing was less serious than what followed. Our Lady himself felt his pride softening. He looked at Judge Vaz de Sainte-Marie for the first time with the eyes of a man. It is so sweet to love that he could not keep from dissolving into a feeling of sweet, trusting tenderness for the judge. Maybe he ain't a louse, he thought, and at once his sweet insensitivity collapsed, and the relief it afforded him was like the release of urine from the penis after a night of continence. Remember that when Darling used to wake up, he would find himself on earth after he had pissed. Our Lady loved his executioner, his first executioner. He was already granting a kind of wavering premature pardon to the icy monocle, the metallic hair, the earthly mouth, the future sentence delivered according to frightful scriptures. Exactly what is an executioner? A child dressed as a fatal sister, an innocent isolated by the splendor of his purple rags, a poor, a humble fellow. Someone lit the chandeliers and wall lights. The prosecuting attorney took the floor. Against the adolescent murderer who had been cut out of a block of clear water, he said only things that were very fair, within the scope of the judge and jurors. That is, it was necessary to protect rentiers, who sometimes live all the way upstairs, beneath the roof, and to put to death children who slaughtered them. It was all very reasonable, spoken in a very sagacious and at times noble tone, with an accompaniment of his head. It is regrettable, in a minor key, then continuing in the major. It is regrettable. His arm, pointing at the murderer, was obscene. "Strike hard," he cried. "Strike hard." The prisoners referred to him as the blowhard. At that formal session, he illustrated very accurately a poster nailed to a huge door. An old marquise, lost in the darkness of the crowd, thought to herself, "The Republic has already guillotined 5 of us." But her thought went no deeper. The tie was still on the table. The jurors still had not got over their fear. It was just about then that the clock struck 5. During the indictment, Our Lady had sat down. The courthouse seemed to him to be situated between apartment buildings at the rear of the kind of well-shaped inner courtyard on which all the kitchen and toilet windows look out, where uncombed housemaids lean forward and, with their hands cupped over their ears, listen and try to miss nothing of the proceedings. 5 stories and 4 faces. The maids are toothless and spy on each other behind them. Through the gloom of the kitchen, one can make out the gold or plush spangles in the mystery of the opulent apartments where ivory-headed old gentlemen watch with tranquil eyes the approach of murderers in slippers. For Our Lady, the courthouse is at the bottom of this well. It is small and light, like the Greek temple that Minerva carries in her open hand. The guard at his left made him stand up, for the judge was questioning him.
"What do you have to say in your defense?"
The old tramp who was his cellmate in the Santé prison had prepared a few suitable words for him to say to the court. He looked for them but was unable to find them. The phrase, "I didn't do it on purpose," took shape on his lips. Had he said it, nobody would have been surprised. Everyone expected the worst. All the answers that occurred to him came forward in slang, and a feeling for the propriety suggested to him that he speak French, but everyone knows that in trying moments it is the mother tongue that prevails. He had to be natural. To be natural at that moment was to be theatrical. But his maladroitness saved him from ridicule and lopped off his head. He was truly great. He said, "The old guy was washed up. He couldn't even get a hard-on." The last word did not pass his jaunty little lips. Nevertheless, the 12 old men, all together, very quickly put their hands over their ears to prevent the entry of the word that was as big as an organ, which, finding no other orifice, entered all stiff and hot into their gaping mouths. The virility of the 12 old men and of the judge was flouted by the youngster's glorious immodesty. Everything was changed. Those who were Spanish dancers, with castanets on the fingers, became jurors again. The sensitive painter became a juror again. The old man of cloth became a juror again. So did the old grouch. So did the one who was Pope and the one who was Vestris. You don't believe me? The audience heaved a sigh of rage. With his beautiful hands, the judge made the gesture that tragic actresses make with their lovely arms. 3 subtle shudders ruffled his red robe, as if it were a theater curtain, as if there clung to the hap at the calf the desperate claws of a dying kitten, the muscles of whose paws had been contracted by 3 little death throes. He nervously ordered Our Lady to behave with decorum, and the lawyer for the defense took the floor, with mincing little steps under his robe, which were really like little farts, he came to the bar and addressed the court. The court smiled, that is, with the smile imparted to the face by the austere choice already made between the just and the unjust, the royal rigor of the brow that knows the dividing line, that has seen clear and judged, and that condemns. The court was smiling. The faces were relaxing from the tension. The flesh was softening up again. Little pouts were ventured, but quickly startled, withdrew into their shells. The court was pleased, quite pleased. The lawyer was doing his utmost. He spoke volubly. His sentences went on and on. One felt that they had been born of lightning and would peter out in tales of comets. He was mingling what he said were his childhood memories, of his own childhood in which he himself had been tempted by the devil, with notions of pure law. Despite such contact, pure law remained pure, and, in the grey drool, retained its hard, crystal brilliance. The lawyer spoke first of being brought up in the gutter. The example of the street, of hunger, of thirst. My God, he was going to make of the child a Father de Foucault or a Michel Vouchange. He spoke also of the almost carnal temptation of the neck, which is made the way it is in order to be squeezed. In short, he was off the track. Our Lady esteemed this eloquence. He did not yet believe what the lawyer was saying, but he was ready to undertake anything, to assume anything. Yet a feeling of uneasiness, the meaning of which he understood only later, indicated to him, by obscure means, that the lawyer was undoing him. The court was cursing so mediocre a lawyer who was not even according it the satisfaction of overcoming the pity it should normally have felt while following the speech for the defense. What game was this idiotic lawyer playing? If only he would say a word, a trifling, a crude word, that would make the jurors, for at least the space and time of a murderous leer, be smitten with an adolescent corpse, and thus, avenging the strangled old man, feel that they in turn had the soul of a murderer, sitting comfortably in the warm room without any risks except merely the little eternal damnation. Their pleasure was disappearing. Would they have to acquit because the lawyer was a blockhead? But did anyone think that this might have been the supreme foxiness of a poet-lawyer? Napoleon is said to have lost Waterloo because Wellington committed a blunder. The court felt that it had to sanctify this young man. The lawyer was drooling. He was speaking at the moment of possible re-education in their reserve stall. The 4 representatives of the church youth centers then played poker dice to settle the fate of the soul of Our Lady of the Flowers. The lawyer was asking for an acquittal. He was imploring. They no longer understood him. Finally, as with a promptness for sensing the one moment in 1,000, for saying the crucial word, Our Lady, gently, as always, screwed up his face and said, though without thinking it, "Ah, no, not the corrida. It ain't worth it. I'd rather croak right away." The lawyer stood there dumbfounded. Then quickly, with a cluck of his tongue, he gathered his scattered wits and stammered, "Child, see here, child, let me defend you." "Gentlemen," he said to the court. He might without any harm, as to a queen, have said, "Madame." "He's a child." At the same time, the judge was saying to Our Lady, see here, what are you saying? Let's not rush matters." The cruelty of the word stripped the judges and left them with no other robe than their splendor. The crowd cleared his throat. The presiding judge did not know that in slang, the corrida is the reformatory. Sitting motionless on his wooden bench, squarely and solidly, between his guards in their yellow leather girths and their boots and helmets, Our Lady of the Flowers felt himself dancing a light jig. Despair had shot through him like an arrow, like a clown through the tissue paper of a hoop. Despair had gone beyond him, and all that remained was the laceration which left him there, in white rags. Though he was not intact, he held his ground. The world was no longer in the room. That's how it should be. It all has to end. The court was re-entering. The rapping of the rifle butts of the guard of honor gave the alarm. Standing, bareheaded, the monocle read the verdict. It uttered for the first time, following the name Bayon, the words, known as Our Lady of the Flowers. Our Lady was given the death penalty. The jury was standing. It was the apotheosis. It's all over. When Our Lady of the Flowers was given back to the guards, he seemed to them invested with a sacred character, like the kind that expiatory victims, whether goat, ox, or child, had in olden times, and which kings and Jews still have today. The guard spoke to him and served him as if, knowing he was laden with the weight of the sins of the world, they had wanted to bring down upon themselves the benediction of the Redeemer. 40 days later, on a spring evening, the machine was set up in the prison yard. At dawn, it was ready to cut. Our Lady of the Flowers had his head cut off by a real knife. And nothing happened. What would be the point? There's no need for the veil of the temple to be ripped from top to bottom because a god gives up the ghost. All that this can prove is the bad quality of the cloth and its deterioration. Though it behooves me to be indifferent, still, I would not mind if an irreverent scapegrace kicked through it and ran off shouting, "A miracle!" It's flashy and would make a very good framework for the legend. I have reread the earlier chapters. They are now closed, rigorously, and I note that I have given no smile to Coulafoi, Divine, Ernestine, or the others. The sight of a little boy in the visitor's room makes me aware of this and makes me think of my childhood, of the ribbons on my mother's white petticoats. In each child I see, but I see so few, I try to find the child I was, to love him for what I was. But when I saw the miners during the medical examination, I look at those two little mugs, and I left feeling deeply moved, for that was not what I had been like. Too white a child, like an underbaked loaf of bread. It is for the men they will be that I love them. When they pass before me, rolling their hips and with their shoulders erect, I already saw at their shoulder blades the hump of the muscles covering the roots of their wings. All the same, I would like to think that I was like that one. I saw myself again in his face, especially in his forehead and eyes, and I was about to recognize myself completely when, bang, he smiled. It was no longer I, for in my childhood I could no more laugh or even smile than in any other period of my life. When the child laughed, I crumbled, so to speak, before my very eyes. Like all children, adolescents, or mature men, I smiled readily. I even laughed heartily, but as my life rounded out a cycle, I dramatized it, eliminating the elements of mischievousness, levity, and prankishness. I have retained only those which are properly tragic: fear, despair, unhappy love. And I free myself from them only by declaiming those poems which are as convulsed as the faces of sibyls. They leave my soul clarified. But if the child in whom I think I see myself laughs or smiles, he breaks up the drama which had been constructed and which is my past life when I think back to it. He destroys it, falsifies it, at least because he manifests an attitude which the character could not have had. He tears to bits the memory of a harmonious, though painful, life, forces me to see myself becoming another, and, on the first drama, grafts a second. Divinariana, conclusion. So, here are the last Divinariana. I'm in a hurry to get rid of divine. I toss off helter-skelter at random the following notes in which you, by unscrambling them, will try to find the essential form of the saint. Divine, in thought, pushes mimicry to the point of assuming the exact posture that Darling had assumed in that very spot. Thus, her head is in the place of Darling's head, her mouth in place of his mouth, her member in place of his member, etc. Then she repeats as exactly as possible, hesitantly, for it must be done with studied refinement. Refinement alone, by its difficulty, makes one aware of the game. The gestures that were Darling's gestures. She occupies successively all the space he occupied. She follows him, feels continually all that contained him. Divine. My life? I'm desolate. I'm a valley of desolation. And it is a valley similar with pines black beneath the storm to the landscapes I have discovered during my imaginary adventures beneath the brown lice-infested blankets of prisons everywhere, and which I call Valley of Desolation, of Consolation, Vale of Angels. She, Divine, did not act. Perhaps in accordance with Christ, she was reproached for this, but she. Does Leifer dance home from the opera? Her detachment from the world is such that she says, what does it matter to me what X thinks of the divine I was? What do I care about the memory he has of me? I am another. Each time I will be another. Thus she fought against vanity. Thus she was always ready for some new infamy, without feeling the fear of opprobrium. She cut off her lashes so as to be even more repulsive, thinking she is thus burning her boats. She lost her mannerisms. She managed to attract attention by dint of discretion, freezing her face. Formerly, when insulted, she could not keep from twitching her muscles. Anguish drove her to that so that it might be slightly beguiled. The puckering of her face produced a grimace in the form of a smile. Frozen, her face, divine of herself. Lady of high pansiness. Divine could not bear hearing on the radio the march from the Zuberflaut. She kisses her fingers, and then, unable to bear it any longer, she turns the dial. Her pale celestial voice, a voice I would like to imagine being that of movie actors, a voice of an image, a flat voice, telling me, as she pointed to my ear, "But Jean, you've got another hole there." She strolls in the street. She is spectral. A young cyclist walks by, holding his machine by the handlebar. Quite near, Divine makes an airy gesture with arm rounded, of enlacing him about the waist. The cyclist suddenly turns to Divine, who finds herself actually enlacing him. He looks at her for a fraction of a second, astounded, says not a word, jumps on his bike, and flees. Divine retreats into her shell and regains her inner heaven. In the presence of another handsome young man, a brief desire. It's thee again that has clutched me by the throat. She will go on living only to hasten toward death. The swan, borne up by its mass of white feathers, cannot go to the bottom of the water to find mud, nor can Jesus sin. For Divine, to commit a crime in order to free oneself from the yoke of the moral powers is still to be tied up with the moral. She will have nothing to do with a fine crime. She sings that she is buggered out of taste. She robs and betrays her friends. Everything concurs to establish about her, despite her, solitude. She lives simply in the privacy of her glory. Of the glory she has made tiny and precious. I am, she says, Bernadette Soubirous, in the convent of Charity after her long vision. Like me, she lived an ordinary life, with the memory of having spoken familiarly with the Holy Virgin. At times, a regiment goes into the desert and, for purposes of tactics, a small column of men detaches itself and goes off in a different direction. The fragment may advance thus for some time, quite near the regiment for an hour or more. The men of the two sections could speak together, see one another. And they do not speak together. They do not see one another. No sooner did the detachment take a step in the new direction than it felt a personality being born to it. It knew that it was alone and that its actions were its actions. Divine has repeated 100 times that little gesture for detaching herself from the world. But, however far she may depart from it, the world calls her back. She has spent her life hurling herself from the top of a rock. Now that she no longer has a body, or she has so little left, a little that is whitish, pale, bony, and at the same time very flabby, she slips off to heaven, divine of herself. Madame n'est secret. The saintliness of divine. Unlike most saints, divine had knowledge of it. There's nothing surprising in this, since saintliness was her vision of God, and higher still, her union with him. This vision did not occur without difficulty, pain, on both sides. On divine's side, the difficulty was due to her having to give up a stable, familiar, and comfortable situation for too wondrous a glory. To retain her position, she did what she thought fitting. She made gestures. Her whole body was then seized with a frenzy to remain behind. She made gestures of frightful despair, other gestures of hesitation, of timid attempts to find the right way, to cling to earth, and not rise to heaven. This last sentence seems to imply that divine made an ascension. That is not so. Rising to heaven here means, without moving, to leave divine, for the divinity, the miracle, occurring in privacy, would have been ferocious in its horror. She had to stand her ground, whatever the cost, had to hold her own against God, who was summoning her in silence, had to keep from answering, but had to attempt the gestures that will keep her on earth, that would replant her firmly in matter. In space, she kept devising new and barbaric forms for herself, for she sensed intuitively that immobility makes it too easy for God to get you in a good wrestling hold and carry you off. So she danced, while walking everywhere. Her body was always manifesting itself, manifesting 1,000 bodies. Nobody was aware of what was going on and of divine's tragic moments as she struggled against God. She assumed poses as astounding as those of certain Japanese acrobats. You might have taken her for some mad, tragic actress who, unable to re-enter her own personality, keeps trying. Finally, one day when she wasn't expecting it, as she lay still in bed, God took her and made her a saint. Let us mention, however, a characteristic event. She wanted to kill herself, to kill my kindness. The following brilliant idea therefore occurred to her, and she carried it out. Her balcony, which was on the 9th floor of an apartment house, looked down on a paved court. The iron railing was latticed, but across it stretching a wire netting. One of her neighbors had a 2-year-old baby girl to whom Divine used to give candy and who occasionally came to visit her. The child would run to the balcony and look at the street through the netting. One day, Divine made up her mind. She detached the netting and left it leaning against the railing. When the little girl came to see her, she locked her in and ran downstairs. When she got to the yard, she waited for the child to go and play on the balcony and lean against the railing. The weight of her body made her fall into the void. From below, Divine watched. None of the child's pirouettes was lost on her. She was superhuman, to the point of, without tears or cries or shudders, gathering with her gloved fingers what remained of the child. She was given 3 months of preventive custody for involuntary manslaughter. But her goodness was dead, for what good would it do me? To be 1,000 times good now, how could this inexpiable crime ever be redeemed? So let us be bad. Indifferent, so it seemed, to the rest of the world. Divine was dying. For a long time, Ernestine did not know what had become of her son, whom she had lost sight of when he ran away a second time. When she finally did hear from him, he was a soldier. She received a somewhat sheepish letter asking her for a little money, but she did not see her son, who had become divine, until quite some time later in Paris, where she had gone for an operation, as do all women from the provinces. Divine was then living in her rather grand style. Ernestine, who knew nothing about her vice, guessed it almost instantly and thought to herself, Lou's got an El Dorado between his buttocks. She made no comment to him. It hardly affected her opinion of herself to know that she had brought forth a monstrous creature, neither male nor female, scion or scioness, of the Paquanese, ambiguous issue of a great family, of which the siren Melusina was mother. Mother and son were as remote as if they had been at a distance, looking into the emptiness, a grazing of insensitive skins. Ernestine never said to herself, he is flesh of my flesh. Divine never said to herself, all the same, she's the one who spawned me. But Divine was, for her mother, a pretext for theatrical gestures, as we showed at the beginning. Divine, out of hatred of that bitch of a mimosa who detested her mother, pretended to herself to love and respect her own. This respect pleased Darling, who, like a good pimp, like a real bad boy, had deep down in his heart, as they say, a little spot of purity dedicated to an old mamma, whom he did not know. He obeyed the earthly injunctions that govern pimps. He loved his mother, just as he was a patriot and a Catholic. Ernestine came to see Divine die. She brought some sweets, but by signs that country women recognize, signs that tell more surely than crepe, she had known that Divine was leaving. He's going away, she said to herself. The priest, the same one we saw officiating so oddly, brought the Holy Sacrament. A candle was burning on the little tea table, near a black crucifix and a bowl of holy water, in which a dry, dusty little branch of box holly was soaking. Usually, Ernestine accepted in religion only what was most purely marvelous in it, not the mystery that is added to the mystery and conceals it. The marvelous that she found in it was as sound as sterling. Judge from the following: knowing that lightning has a fancy for entering by the chimney and leaving by the window, she, from her armchair, would watch herself go through the window panes, retaining, including her bust, neck, legs, and skirts, the stiffness, the coagulation of a starched cloth, and falling on the lawn or rising to the sky with her heels together as if she were a statue. Thus, she would fall downward or upward, the way we see saints and angels flying in old paintings, the way Jesus goes straight to heaven without being carried by clouds. That was her religion. As at other times, the days of big flush and gush, days of mystic debauch, she would say to herself, suppose I played at believing in God. She would do it until she trembled. At the hour of Divine's death, she played so well at believing in God that she couldn't help having a bit of transport. She saw God gulping down an egg. To see is here a casual way of speaking. Regarding revelation, there's not much I can say, for all I know of it is what was granted me to know, thanks to God, in a Yugoslav prison. I had been taken from town to town. Depending on where the police van stopped, I would stay a day or two, sometimes longer, in each of the town prisons. Finally, I arrived and was locked up in a rather large room with about 20 other prisoners. These gypsies had organized a school for pickpockets there. It worked as follows. While one of the prisoners lay sleeping on his bunk, each of us in turn had to remove from his pockets and put back without waking him the objects that were already there. It was a delicate work, for we often had to tickle the sleeper in a certain way so that he would turn in his sleep and free the pocket on which he was lying with the full weight of his thighs. When it was my turn to operate, the head gypsy called me and ordered me to go to work. Beneath the cloth of the jacket, I felt my heart beating, and I fainted. I was carried to my bunk and was left there until I came to. I still have a very exact memory of the arrangement of the theater. The cell was a kind of passageway that left just enough room for the sloping wooden bunks that lined the wall. At one of the ends, opposite the door, was a slightly arched skylight, which was fortified with bars. The yellow light that filtered in from a sky invisible to us was falling obliquely, exactly the way it is shown in prints and novels. When I regained consciousness, I was in the corner near the window. I squatted, the way the Berbers and little children do, with my feet wrapped in a blanket. In the other corner, standing in a bunch, were the other men. They looked at me and burst out laughing. As I did not know their language, one of them pointed at me and made the following gesture. He scratched his hair and, as if he had pulled out a louse, made a show of eating it with the mimetic gestures characteristic of monkeys. I do not remember whether I had lice. In any case, I have never devoured any. My head was covered with dandruff that formed a crust which I would scrape off with my nail and then knock from my nail with my teeth, which I sometimes swallowed. It was at that moment that I understood the room. I realized, for a fraction of a second, its essence. It remained a room, though a prison of the world. I was, through my monstrous horror, exiled to the confines of the obscene, which is the off-scene of the world. Facing the graceful pupils of the school of light-fingered theft, I saw clearly, as in the case of Ernestine, what the room and those men were, what role they were playing. It was a major role in the march of the world. This role was the origin of the world, and at the origin of the world, it seemed to me suddenly, thanks to a kind of extraordinary lucidity, that I understood the system. The world dwindled, and its mystery too, as soon as I was cut off from it. It was a truly supernatural moment, similar in respect to this detachment from the human, to the one I experienced when Chief Warrant Officer Cesari, at the Cherche Midi prison, had to write a report on my sexual practices. He said to me, "That word," he did not dare utter the word homosexual, "is written as 2 words?" And he pointed to it on the sheet with his forefinger extended, but not touching the word. I was ravished. Like me, Ernestine was ravished by God's angels, who are details, meetings, coincidences of the following order. The toe step, or perhaps the meeting place of the thighs of the ballerina, which the smile of a beloved soldier makes blossom in the hollow of my chest. She held the world between her fingers for a moment and looked at it with the severity of a schoolmistress. During the preparation for the last sacrament, Divine emerged from her coma. On seeing the taper, beacon of her own end, she quailed. She realized that death had always been present in life, though its symbolic face had been hidden by a kind of mustache, which adjusted its ghastly reality to current taste, that Frankish mustache which, once soldierly, now falling from the scissors, made it look as sheepish as a castrato. For its face at once grew gentle and delicate pale, with a tiny chin and rounded forehead, like the face of a female saint on Romanesque stained glass or a Byzantine empress, a face we are accustomed to seeing capped with a veiled hennin. Death was so close that it could touch Divine, could tap at her, with its lean forefinger, as at a door. She clenched her rigid fingers, tugged at the sheets, which also stiffened, froze. "But," she said to the priest, "I'm not dead yet. I've heard the angels farting on the ceiling." "Dead yet," she repeated to herself, and in voluptuously swinging, nauseating, and in effect paradisial clouds, Divine again sees the dead woman, and the death of the dead woman, old Adeline of the village, who used to tell him and Solange stories about Negroes. When the old woman, his cousin, died, he was unable to weep, and in order nevertheless to make people think that he was deeply grieved, it occurred to him to moisten his dry eyes with saliva. A ball of smoke is rolling in the heart of Divine's belly. Then she feels herself being invaded, as if by seasickness, by the soul of old Adeline, whose high-heeled button shoes Ernestine made her wear to school after the old lady's death. On the night of the wake, moved by curiosity, Coulafroid got up. As he started to tiptoe out of his room, there surged forth from every corner a throng of souls which formed a barrier that he had to cross. He entered into their midst, strong in his hierarchic delegation, frightened, thrilled, more dead than alive. The souls, the shades, formed an immense, a numerous cortege, rose up from the beginnings of the world. Generations of shades trailed behind him to the deathbed. It was fear. He was walking barefoot, as solemnly as possible. He was advancing as a thief in the night is supposed to advance. Perhaps as many a night he had stolen to the closet to steal sugared almonds, almonds that had been given to Ernestine at some baptism or wedding, and which he munched with respect, not as a trivial tidbit, but as a sacred food, a symbol of purity, regarding them in the same way he did white wax orange blossoms that lay under a glass globe, a musty smell of incense, a vision of white veils, and that air, the venicetor. What if the woman keeping vigil is at her post? What will she say? But she was in the kitchen, drinking coffee. The room was empty, emptied. Death creates a vacuum otherwise and better than does an air pump. The bed sheets outlined the face in relief, like clay that has barely been touched by the sculptor. With outstretched hand and rigid arm, Coulafroid lifts the sheets. The corpse was still there. He drew near so as to be less frightened. He dared touch the face and even kiss the eyelids, which were as round and icy as agate marbles. The body seemed fecundated by reality. It was utterly the truth. At that moment, the child was invaded, as it were, by a disorderly troop of memories of readings and stories he had heard. For example, that the room of Bernadette Soubrieux at the hour of her death was full of the scent of invisible violets. He therefore instinctively sniffed, but did not recognize the odor that is said to be the odor of sanctity. God was forgetting his servant, and a good thing, too. In the first place, you shouldn't waste the scent of flowers on the bed of a dead old maid, and furthermore, you should fear to sow panic in the souls of children. But that moment seems to have been the starting point of the thread that was to lead Coulafroid Divine, in accordance with a superlatively devised fatality, to death. The tentative groping had begun long before. The preliminary investigation, which had been carried on at first in wonderment, arising at the first replies, dated from remote, misty, opaque ages, when he belonged to the people of the gods, exactly like the primitives, who have not yet unswaddled of their urine-scented wrappings, and who possess the dignity which they share with children and certain animals, the gravity and the nobility that are rightly called ancient, now, and increasingly so, until the attainment of the exactly poetic vision of the world knowledge, the swaddling clothes were thrust aside, as each questioning, each sounding rendered a more and more hollow sound. It indicated death, which is the only reality that satisfies us wholly. Gone was the joyous rebound upon contact with objects. At each touch, his blindly scrutinizing little finger plunged into emptiness. Doors turned by themselves and revealed nothing. He kissed the old lady on the eyes, and the snake-like iciness froze him. He was about to reel, perhaps fall, when the memory came to his rescue, the memory of Alberto's corduroy pants. As a man who, through some unexpected privilege, has caught a glimpse of the very heart of the mysteries, quickly looks away so as to regain his footing on earth, so the terror-stricken Coulafoi flung himself, bearing his head into the warm, enveloping memory of Alberto's trousers, where he thought to find to his relief comforting broods of titmice. Then, borne by Alberto, who had come down from heaven, he went back to his room and to bed, where he wept. But, and don't let this surprise you, he wept at being unable to weep. Here is how our great divine died. Having looked for her little gold watch, she found it between her thighs, and with her fist closed over it, handed it to Ernestine, who was sitting at her bedside. Their two hands met in the form of a shell with the watch in the middle. A vast physical peace relaxed divine. Filth and almost liquid shit spread out beneath her, like a warm little lake into which she gently, very gently, as the vessel of a hopeless emperor sinks, still warm, into the waters of Lake Nemi, was engulfed. And with this relief she heaved another sigh, which rose to her mouth with blood. Then another sigh, the last. Thus did she pass away. One might also say she drowned. Ernestine was waiting. Suddenly, by some miracle, she realized that the throbbing of their joined hands was the ticking of the watch. Because she lived among omens and signs, she was not superstitious. She therefore laid out the corpse all by herself, and dressed divine in a very modest blue cheviot suit of English cut. So, here she is, dead, but quite dead. Her body is caught in the sheets. It is from head to foot forever a ship in the breaking up of ice floes, motionless and rigid, drifting toward infinity. You, Jean, dear heart, motionless and rigid, as I have already said, drifting on my bed to a happy eternity. And with divine dead, what is left for me to do? To say, this evening, the poplars of which I see only the tops are being cruelly dashed together by an angry wind. My cell, lulled by that kindly death, is so sweet today. What if I were free tomorrow? Tomorrow is the day of my hearing. Free, in other words, exiled among the living. I have made myself a soul to fit my dwelling. My cell is so sweet, free, to drink wine, to smoke, to see ordinary people. And tomorrow, what will the jury be like? I have anticipated the stiffest possible sentence it can inflict. I have prepared myself for it with great care, for I have chosen my horoscope, according to what I can read of it from past events, as a figure of fatality. Now that I can obey it, my grief is less great. It is annihilated in the face of the irremediable. It is my hopelessness, and what will be, will be. I have given up my desires. I, too, am already far beyond that. Wiedemann. Let me therefore live between these walls for a man's lifetime. Who will be judged tomorrow? Some stranger bearing a name that was once my name. I can continue to die until my death amidst all these widowers, lamp, wash basin, regulations, broom, and the straw mattress, my spouse. I do not feel like going to sleep. Tomorrow's hearing is a solemnity that requires a vigil. It is this evening that I should like to weep, as one who stays behind for my farewells. But my lucidity is like a nakedness. The wind outside is getting wilder and wilder, and is being joined by the rain. The elements are thus a prelude to tomorrow's ceremonies. Today's the 12th, isn't it? What shall I decide? Warnings are said to come from God. They don't interest me. I already feel that I no longer belong to the prison. Broken is the exhausting fraternity that bound me to the men of the tomb. Perhaps I shall live. At times, I am shaken with a burst of brutal and unaccountable laughter. It resounds within me like a joyous cry in the fog, which it seems to be trying to dissipate, but it leaves no trace other than a wistful longing for sun and gaiety. What if I am condemned? I shall don homespun again, and this rust-colored garment will immediately entail the monastic gesture, hiding my hand in my sleeves, and the equivalent attitude of mind will follow. I shall feel myself becoming humble and glorious. Then, snug under my blankets, it is in Don Juan that the characters come back to life on the stage and kiss each other. I shall, for the enchantment of my cell, refashion lovely new lives for darling, divine, Our Lady, and Gabrielle. I have read moving letters full of wonderful touches, of despair, of hope, of songs, and others more severe. I am choosing from among them one which will be the letter Darling wrote to Divine from prison. Dearest, I'm writing a few lines to give you the news which isn't good. I've been arrested for stealing, so try to get a lawyer to handle my case. Arrange to pay him, and also arrange to send me a money order because you know how lousy things are here. Also, try to get permission to come and see me and bring me some linens. Put in the blue and white silk pajamas and some undershirts. Dearest, I'm awfully sorry about what's happened to me. Let's face it, I'm plain unlucky. So I'm counting on you to help me out. I only wish I could have you in my arms so I could hold you and squeeze you tight. Remember the things we used to do together. Try to recognize the dotted lines and kiss it. 1,000 big kisses, sweetheart, from your darling. The dotted line that Darling refers to is the outline of his prick. I once saw a pimp who had a hard-on while writing to his girl place his heavy cock on the paper and trace its contours. I would like that line to portray Darling. Fres, Prison, 1942.